Maurice Leloir was born in Paris in 1853 into a particularly artistic gene pool. His grandfather was the artist Alexandre Marie Leloir. His father, Auguste Jean-Baptiste Leloir, was also a highly respected painter. And his mother was the watercolourist Héloïse Suzanne Collin, the daughter of Alexandre Collin, yet another successful artist of the period. Maurice's older brother, Alexandre Louis, also went on to become a well-known painter and illustrator, but unfortunately he died in 1884 at just 40 years old. Maurice studied with his father in his early years and subsequently went on for more formal training at Paris's École des Beaux-Arts, but his studies were abandoned in the chaos of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. He first exhibited his painted work in 1876, and as with all art of this period, his paintings were invariably displayed within flamboyant gilt frames. But from here onwards I'm showing them without, as they are a distraction from the image, and their inclusion makes the pictures smaller on screen. That I've always had an aversion to such framing has absolutely nothing to do with my decision. Following that first exhibition, it appears that he quickly found success in what was a highly competitive market in Paris at the time, and he produced quite a few more evocative paintings during the rest of the decade, all of which demonstrated particularly high levels of technical prowess and aesthetic consideration. In the year Leloir had been born, the destruction of medieval Paris and its more formal and grandiose remodelling under the supervision of Baron Haussmann had begun, and it continued throughout the decades of Leloir's early life. And as I previously mentioned, in 1870 France was at war, and the siege of Paris and subsequent French surrender was closely followed by the violent uprising of the Paris Commune, and a decade of serious political instability. So it seems quite likely that Leloir's paintings were a reaction to a troubled present by depicting a nostalgic and romanticised past. Chief among his influences was the work of the 18th century Rococo artist Jean-Honoré Fragonard, who had made his reputation with erotically suggestive scenes of the wealthy at play. And although not all Leloir's paintings portrayed the upper classes, his portrayal of those lower down the societal ladder clearly suggested they were a much happier band than the discontented masses of his own time. Leloir worked in both oils and watercolour, and the astonishing level of his skills with both meant that the images were plausible to a degree we now generally call photorealistic. His oil paintings were usually quite large and frequently more than a metre wide or high, but his watercolours, such as this phenomenally detailed and precisely rendered image, were invariably smaller, at around 20 by 30 centimetres. Although I couldn't find the precise year, it was around this time that Leloir married Céline Baudier, and they had a daughter, Suzanne. But what is certain is that he made his debut as an illustrator in 1882 when he was 29 years old. In that year he began a long-running commission, which he shared with the similarly styled illustrator Jacques Lemain, for the publication of the entire works of the 17th century playwright Molière. They were all published as finely transcribed engravings by Géry Béchard, and although this project lasted for over a decade, it didn't consume as much of Leloir's time as you might expect, as each volume contained just one image. But whatever they lacked in quantity, they more than made up for in quality, and like all his work, they revealed a scrupulous approach to the reference of props, costumes and architecture. His figure work was invariably based on observation of models. He also began acquiring what would be a massive collection of period costumes to inform his work. In 1884 he went on to illustrate an edition of Laurence Sterne's 1768 novel, A Sentimental Journey Through France and Italy, which for the first time in his illustration career also featured a few chromolithographically printed colour pages, in addition to the expected engraved monochromes. In 1886, his illustrations, engraved by Louis Rouet, were published in an edition of The Story of the Chevalier des Grieux and Manon Lescaut, a novel by Antoine François Prévost, originally published in 1730. The book is a tragic account of a doomed love affair between a nobleman and a low-born woman, and its emotional appeal and period setting were perfect material for Leloir. It was reprinted numerous times, with some later editions featuring overprinted colour. This outpouring of illustration work wasn't instead of his career in art, but in addition to it, and he continued to produce yet more of his expected period imagery in both watercolour and oils with great success. Nevertheless, in 1888 he returned to illustration with the novel Paul and Virginia, written precisely a century earlier by Jacques-Henri Bernardin de Saint-Pierre. This story was set in what was then called l'Île de France, but later became Mauritius, and Leloir must have either made regular visits to study exotic plant collections in Parisian botanical gardens, or at the very least reference botanical drawings in books in order to make his scenic images convincing. A year later he illustrated a 2-volume edition of the autobiography of the 18th century philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The narrative content of this work was fairly sedate in tone, and this was reflected in the illustration Leloir created in support. But however lacking in dramatic impact or visual energy they may have been, they were uniformly well studied and rendered images, and of course historically impeccable as always. In 1890 he had this painting reproduced on the cover of Le Figaro magazine, and he kept up a steady stream of more paintings, including very occasional forays into more contemporary subject matter, such as this oil painting titled In the Library. A year or so later he also painted this emotionally charged scene from the story of Manon Lescaut, the book he had illustrated just 5 years before. He also illustrated a contemporary novella, Le Bibliomane, written by Charles Nodier, published in 1893. This was the strange story of a man who becomes increasingly obsessed with owning books, and its far from commonplace narrative prompted Leloir to create some uncharacteristically disturbing monochromes. In 1894 he was commissioned to illustrate Alexandre Dumas' adventure story The Three Musketeers, originally published 50 years earlier. Leloir and Dumas, despite the writer's death in 1870, proved to be a perfect marriage of written fiction and narrative illustration. This was another 2-volume monochrome publication, with in excess of 100 illustrations in each volume. And as usual, Leloir's original drawings were transcribed with great sensitivity and visual clarity, but in this case by the engraver Jules Huot, whose own contribution really made this a blend of 3 major talents. Every image Leloir created for this epic adventure was a gleeful, energetic visualization of the events of the story, and it's not surprising that it has been reprinted many times since. But following this major illustrative undertaking, Leloir took a few years sabbatical from bookwork and spent most of the rest of the decade creating more romanticised painted scenes from France's past. Even so, in 1898 he appeared on the cover of Le Figaro again, and in 1899 he embarked on another long run of illustrated projects. Among them was his own written and illustrated work A Woman of Quality in the Past Century, which depicted the imagined life of a female aristocrat in the later 1700s. And the watercolours he produced for this limited edition book constituted another valuable record of the lives of the wealthy in this historical period, which was as informative as it was visually entertaining. By the turn of the century, Leloir's reputation in both art and illustration had made him wealthy and remarkably popular, and among other peripheral commissions, his work was reproduced on ladies' fans, and there was also this incredibly detailed painted screen, which I can only assume was a private commission. It was also at this time that he was commissioned by the prestigious Parisian department store Le Bon Marché to create various series of lithographically printed images, one of which featured stories from Aesop's fables, with the characters represented by French human stereotypes, and others featuring children in 18th century costume. I have no idea in what context they were published, but whatever they were yet more evidence of Leloir's talent and status. In 1901, a book about the life of the 17th century figure Cardinal Richelieu, Louis XIII's chief advisor, written by Theodore Cahoux, was published. And this particularly lavishly bound and printed volume featured a large number of images printed in colour from Leloir's pen, line and watercolour wash originals, and consequently not engraved by others. Leloir brought total authority to each image, delineating the life of this extraordinarily powerful and somewhat sinister man, with scenes of palatial plotting and sword fights in equal measure, and the book was another which had to be reprinted several times to meet enduring demand. In 1903, Leloir had more success with his two-volume edition of Alexandre Dumas' La Dame de Montsoreau, which returned to monochromes reproduced as wood engravings by Jules Hoyot from Leloir's pen and wash illustrations. The period detail and costume was as always immaculate, and the plausibility of all his characters and posing was equally authentic. From more formally composed, sedate moments from the narrative through to more energetic, dynamically structured scenes, this was another powerful and memorable collection of illustrations which added considerably to the book's appeal and commercial success. 1904 was a particularly prolific year for Leloir, with two more major undertakings. His exquisite watercolour renders for Jérôme Couchet's collection of poems about the months of the year were published to considerable popular and critical acclaim. Each of these images was artfully worked around the text of each poem, and there were equally delightful watercolour renders produced as title pages for each of the months, with appropriate floral embellishments. And even if they seem somewhat outdated, in a visual culture where others moved inexorably towards more modernist styles and contemporary subjects, their aesthetic beauty and nostalgic ethos continued to appeal to many. Gustave Toulous's story of Louis XIV, known more widely as the Sun King, was like the earlier Richelieu book, an extravagant and expensive publication. Essentially, it was a biography of this monarch's life, and Leloir created a large number of finely drawn and diligently researched colour illustrations, many of which were crowded and complex scenes that would seriously challenge a lesser talent than his. As with all Leloir's illustrations, the evocation of time and place was handled to perfection, and they were highly believable evocations of the grandiose ostentation of the life of the monarch and his entourage. Unsurprisingly, the book was popular enough to merit several more reprints in the years that followed. A year later, he also created some posters for operatic productions, which now look particularly anachronistic in the early 20th century, even if deliberately so. In 1907, he was largely responsible for the foundation of the Historical Costume Society, which devoted itself to the preservation and exhibition of the kind of clothing which featured in his work. Dates of publication vary, but sometime around the turn of the decade, Leloir created images from a production of the contemporary play La Rampe by Henri de Rothschild. I'm unsure why, but some of the images were created and reproduced in both monochrome and colour, but whatever the reason, they were equally striking in either format. In 1910 there was more overtly commercial work, with this illustrated wedding menu for the champagne producers Moet and Chandon. And in the same year he created colour images for a trade calendar for an insurance company on the theme of traditional regional French costume. But other than this, it seems he returned exclusively to art, and this remained the case at a much reduced level throughout the years of the Great War between 1914 and 1918. Even after the war had ended, his illustration work continued to be very occasional, with a decidedly down-market 1921 edition of André Thierry's novel Bigarou, featuring some fairly pedestrian monochrome vignettes. I did find this brochure cover for a chocolate manufacturer published in 1926, but otherwise it seems Leloir devoted himself almost exclusively to painting his favourite subjects, with a complete disregard for the growing adulation for modernity taking place at this time. It is recorded that he was involved in stage design in the later 20s, although I found nothing to show. and in 1929 he was invited to Hollywood by the actor Douglas Fairbanks Jr. to act as a costume designer and consultant for his film of The Man in the Iron Mask, for which I did manage to locate some not very exciting samples. For decades Leloir had been committed to the mammoth undertaking of recording the costumes and armour of antiquity up to 1914. And although of little illustrative interest or distinction, this work was published in a long-running series of historically valuable books from 1933 onwards. And they were still being published even by the time Maurice Leloir died in Paris in 1940 at the age of 87. With very few exceptions, Maurice Leloir spent his entire life and parallel careers pursuing his manifest obsession with French history, whether in fiction or in fact. And despite the societal upheaval and evolution he witnessed during his life, it seems he could not have been less interested in the goings-on of the world around him. And I don't know whether to admire or take exception to this characteristic, but ultimately, for me at least, the sheer visual excellence of all he created silences any other concerns.